This is DGMT's Learning Lunch, and I'm your host, Rahima Esop. Imagine this. You work for an NGO responding to child malnutrition in a rural part of South Africa. The organization is fueled by passion, but it's limited in resources. It's creating tremendous social value, but funding is unstable. It's struggling to juggle program delivery, writing competitive grant proposals, and measure impact as staff juggle multiple roles. Sound familiar? There are no opportunities for leadership development or training. Is this sustainable? The answer is no. Yet this is how many organizations operate, so strengthening them benefits everyone. But the question remains, what is the best strategy to do this? What should organizations prioritize, and how can they lean on one another? On today's episode, we discuss ways to support civil society through funding, resources, and strategies that won't fall flat. We talk to Malibongwe Nkunkuma, Innovation Manager at DGMT. Welcome, Malibongwe.
Thank you so much, Rahima, for the opportunity to just share about strategies around strengthening civil society organization and our approach to it as DGMT.
Well, that's great. Let's get into it then. How would you describe the state of the NGO sector in South Africa?
South Africa has always had a very active and vibrant civil society sector. There are well over 250,000 NGO organizations in South Africa, and that's a conservative number. And these organizations are primarily characterized by three things in 2025, and that is competition for funding, complexity and impact, and capacity regulation and compliance constraints, which actually do hinder an impact on their operations and running of their programs.
That's interesting. Talk to me about the complexity dimension that you spoke about.
Well, we see that NGOs and civil society more broadly is facing immense pressures from different angles. So we've seen funding cuts in terms of from international donors. We've seen regulatory constraints coming from shifting regulation from the government side, and one example of that is the new requirements emanating from the Financial Action Task Force, which have added other requirements that NGOs have to report on. It's very important regulations, but they do actually put an administrative burdens on organizations that are already burdened by compliance regulation. And when it comes to funding, South Africa is no longer the darling of the international philanthropy space. There's a lot more competition for access to resources and funding, and the need is great throughout the world. So we've seen that there's been a dwindling of international funding flows into South Africa. NGOs are facing those two critical challenges, which actually make their operating environment in which they find themselves quite challenging and very complex in order for them to deliver on their mandates.
You said that civil society is no longer the darling of international donors. Tell me what you mean by that.
I think it's quite a complex statement to make, but I think it stems from the fact that I think there's been a recognition that South Africa is a high middle income country with enough resources to actually tackle some of its challenges of inequality head on, but we've had missteps along that journey. And there are other parts of the world. You look at East Africa, the vibrancy in terms of civil society in that area, especially in Africa, that I think funders are starting to ask themselves, is it still worth to journey with South Africa along this journey? And I think it's a double-edged sword, but I think for us, it's an opportunity for South Africa to rise up, for civil society to rise up to the challenge, and for philanthropy in South Africa, for donors and funders in South Africa to collaborate a bit more and to challenge ourselves to get outside the box and work closely together. Also, internationally, donor priorities shift, and perhaps at times we may lag in terms of those shifts, but I think it's a recognition that we have enough resources as a country, and that we must innovate and think differently about how we address the challenges we are facing.
Despite this complexity, we know that the NGO sector has grown over the past decade. What does this tell us about the gap and the critical role that NGOs play in this country?
As I've mentioned earlier on, South Africa has always had a vibrant civil society sector, and it is for that I think we've been able as a country to move forward in certain areas critical to the development of the country and to ensure that we tackle inequality head on, such as education, we find in health. And I think the growth of the sector is a continuation of that legacy. And I think it's very important for legitimacy, for democracy, and to ensure that development outcomes are quite distributed accordingly and that we tackle inequality head on.
And in that effort to tackle inequality, government can't do it alone, and there is a recognition that civil society can reach people in places where government presence and visibility is poor or non-existent.
Yes, definitely. And it is development is anchored in communities. I think the development outcomes that we seek to all achieve manifested themselves in communities. And civil society organizations, I often say, are closest to communities. They are community leaders. They are driven by community leaders, community members, young people. And it's quite important that they are supported and strengthened to actually hold that space where communities can actually express themselves in terms of how they want the development to happen in their communities.
Now, we began talking about the complexity which organizations face, that is dwindling funding accompanied with onerous reporting obligations. How has the limited funding to the sector affected their core functions, or the core functions of different organizations affected by funding cuts?
I think one of the key effects is the fact that it has affected organizations in delivering their programs. We see that in staff retention amongst organizations, where staff retention leads to fewer people working for NGOs, leading to staff burnouts, a high attrition rate. But I think ultimately that actually leads to a dilution of mission and quality of programs overall. And that has a cascading impact sector-wise in different sectors: education, health, youth employment pathways. So that has been the direct impact of this. And I would like to encompass it and say that it's uncertainty and disruption.
I mean, staff retention is a big problem because you want to retain the brightest and best minds, the emerging leaders. You want to retain them in the sector instead of losing them to the public sector or to the private sector. Now, we've outlined the challenges facing civil society organizations. Let's talk about what DGMT's response to those challenges are.
We take a holistic approach to actually organizational development and to organizational strengthening, recognizing that sustainable systemic change requires resilient organizations and well-governed organizations that are well-networked and connected to areas of excellence and the broader sector in which they operate.
Let's go a little bit deeper into DGMT's approach. So how does DGMT envision supporting the sector?
So rather than limiting our role to traditional grant making, we see ourselves as a catalyst for innovation, capacity building, and systemic impact. And we think that it is through the amplified voice of all of us that we can actually secure and ensure that we pursue systemic change. No one NGO or civil society organization can achieve the change that we seek to see. So it's an approach that is grounded in the belief that strong collaborative NGOs are vital to addressing South Africa's deep inequalities and building inclusive development pathways. We support NGOs not only through financial investment or grants, but also by providing technical assistance and focused research, mentorship, and opportunities for collaboration, which we think are vital for a more holistic development approach.
Can we go into a bit more detail? So DGMT doesn't see itself as simply a grant maker. It sees itself as a public innovator in the space. And what is DGMT's contribution to the sector?
Key to our focus is leadership development. We think that well-led and well-governed civil society organizations and NGOs are quite vital. and that means strengthening and assisting NGOs improve on governance, leadership, financial management, strategy development, which we think is critical to ensure that the organizations have a clear direction and vision, monitoring and evaluation, and learning systems. We think as DGMT that encompasses an organization that we think has an ability and the capabilities to actually deliver on the goals that we seek to achieve.
What are some of the ways the DGMT is contributing to strengthening the sector?
We have a menu of offerings that we have as DGMT. Amplify, mobilize, change is one of our critical ones around comms and communications, and we believe that NGOs that are able to tell their stories and tell the stories of their impact are the ones which have the confidence to actually drive and influence the systemic change that we seek to achieve. Also, as DGMT being a grant maker, we're able to get feedback from them in clear and impactful ways. So that's a very important offering that we offer, and we actually provide training, provide resources for comms and comms specialists within civil society organizations and NGOs to actually journey with us over an immersive experience in the program. We have the Innovation Fellowship, which is around the capacity and leadership, collective leadership of young people within the sector. I think young people are the bright spark in South Africa, and that is even more true when it comes to NGOs and civil society. So the Innovation Fellowship is tailor-made to actually work with young people around key leadership capabilities, and that is anchored on actually them answering an innovation question, a question that is sitting deep within their work or within their organizations or within themselves as individuals in the space. So that's another critical offering that we have, the Innovation Fellowship. We have the Legacy Program, which is a program that is designed to actually assist organizations and leaders that are in transitions within their organization. We found that through research that organizations often struggle with managing change. So it's quite a very sensitive and intricate area of work that needs to be handled delicately, and we've taken the time to actually develop a program that speaks to that, and we journey with organizations, their senior leadership around actually transitioning organizations into new heights, new strategies, and leadership change in certain instances.
Let's talk a bit about how NGOs can think differently. Where do they start when it comes to thinking about how best to strengthen their capacity, considering they may have competing needs like fundraising, M&E, or governance, all of which are important?
I think start with people, volunteers, interns, staff within the organization. I think that is where I think NGOs should start. Start with what is around them, the community that in which they find themselves. There's a lot of challenges around that also, but I think that is where NGOs are anchored, and that is where the work is anchored. And then I think starting with people, community, and that filters to skills development, which I think is very critical. The civil society sector is quite a big sector that I think at times is overlooked and underlooked in terms of its contribution even to being as an employer of people, and that should be followed by the right skills which will be serving and be of service to the sector. Skills development is quite critical. Skills around financial management, skills around program management and development, monitoring and evaluation. Those are very critical skills that the sector will always need, and I think that's where we start, people and skills. And building sound governance is a second one which I would like to highlight, ensuring that organizations focus on board development. There's a sound theory of change, clear vision, and focusing on fundraising. But I think with board is very critical to an organization because it's sort of like a mastermind group. So as the organization is shifting and engaging with the complex environment in which it operates, there is a group of people that are sort of thinking with the organization, and it's not just the people in the organization running the organization on a day-to-day. There's a group of people that are a sounding board for the leadership of the organization. I think that is very critical to ensure that there's 360 view that the organization has about its operating environment. But I think more importantly is to be able to prioritize and execute within the competing programs, competing needs. I think organizations that are able to actually prioritize and execute on those priorities are ones which we think are destined for success.
And how can an organization assess where their strengths and weaknesses are? Are there any tools that are available that they can use that are hopefully free to access?
So I would like to highlight international tools first that organizations can look at to actually assess their strengths and weaknesses, more or less. Civicus has a great tool that is internationally benchmarked that organization can use to assess strengths and gaps within the organization. There's from a consulting side, McKinsey Capacity Assessment Grid, which is another tool that organizations can use. Locally, Inyatelo has great tools and resources that organizations can use. We have Lucio Solutions, which we've worked with. They also have a digital assessment tool that is linked to specific modules based on the assessment. We have NACOSA, which has a very comprehensive organizational assessment tool. But I think beyond these ones, there are many assessment tools that are available. I think what I would like to stress is that these tools focus and stress different capacity gaps within organizations. So it is important to vet and to adopt a fitting tool that will actually address the gaps within the organization best. So you have to vet the tool and then start to engage with the process. And I think it's a process that I would like to stress, that it's not a destination.
I'm going to put you on the spot, Malibongwe, and I'm going to force you to back one. Which one would you most recommend?
Because it has a deep local experience, I would recommend NACOSA. They do have an organizational journey to process that they have. They're headquartered in the Western Cape, but I think they have a very comprehensive assessment tool and have a wealth of experience, largely from the health sector, but I think their tools are not limited to the health sector. NACOSA started out with a very strong element and focus on HIV and AIDS and addressing the pandemic. And they've now sort of branched out into other areas because I think they've also seen that to address even that health emergency, we needed to actually be comprehensive and holistic in their approach.
For our listeners, we will put links to all of the organizations that Malibongwe mentioned on our podcast page. Okay, so I'm an organization. I've used one of the tools that you've mentioned to assess where my strengths and weaknesses are. Now what? I've identified that I'm weak in terms of M&E and in terms of my fundraising. Now what? Where do I find help?
I think help is found in spaces where there's just more than one organization in that space. And for me, I think you need to be plugged and connected as an NGO. And I think one of the critical ones, I would say for me, for around funding and fundraising, make sure that you are connected to organizations such as IPASA. For programmatic support, you need to be focused on collaborations that are linked to your sector or that specific sector that as an NGO you're working in. And I know that there's cross-functionality. No single NGO works in one area, but there's usually a key focus that the organization has. So for instance, there's NASCI, the National Association of Social Change Entities in Education, which is a very good platform for NGOs in the education sector. But IPASA is great if you want to find in terms of what are the trends in terms of donors, what are the shifts in funder priorities. So IPASA is the Independent Philanthropy Association of South Africa, very, very active collaboration and quite critical. And I think those are the spaces in which I think organizations need to plug themselves in. As DGMT, we do offer organizational strengthening grants, but obviously, as with any funder with limited resources, we cannot fund every organization out there. But we do have organizational strengthening grant, which we support and provide to organization and generate them over a period of the grant to actually strengthen their systems, finance, HR, mail. It could be any of those systems.
Yeah, I want to understand this. So, for the benefit of my listeners, I want to understand this a bit better. DGMT has 10 opportunities, and when organizations apply for a grant, they would see where they fit in within those 10 opportunities. How do they apply for an organizational strengthening grant? What is the process?
Well, organizations apply the same way as they apply DGMT, but the work around civil society strengthening is anchored on opportunity 1. We do receive referrals from applications that were submitted via other opportunities, the other 9 opportunity areas, because I think it's quite important for us to triage in terms of what the real core issue this typical civil society or an applicant has submitted. But all this work is anchored on opportunity 1, which is to cultivate innovative leaders in society.
Malibongwe, NGOs often talk about creating ecosystems of support for children or for youth or communities. How can we apply the same logic to the sector?
To anchor our work on collaboration is a first step that organizations can do. Embed peer learning in what we do, and practical care and support for all that are within the sector. And we can only lean on each other. So I think those 3 are quite critical, that we need to anchor our work on collaborating and collaborative practice, embed peer learning at the forefront of what we do, and provide care and support for staff, for leaders of organization, and to be aware that we're not operating in silos.
And who should take the lead? Is it the Department of Social Development? Is it philanthropists? Or is it the sector itself?
I think it's a whole society approach. We're all responsible for the health of civil society in South Africa. And I think that work is anchored by a strong and supportive Department of Social Development. Philanthropy and donors must come on board and demystify their approaches, their funding practices, the languages they use must be accessible to civil society organizations and NGOs. And I think NGOs must be vocal in terms of what they are learning from the ground so that it feeds into the system that we are trying to shift.
Thank you so much, Malibongwe, for coming on and talking about organizational strengthening, which we now know is building capacity across governance, finance, monitoring, communications, as you mentioned, and leadership. It's not a peripheral issue. It is core to the functioning of any organization within civil society. It is essential to ensuring that NGOs can deliver on their missions, that they can grow their impact and build long-term sustainability. And now, over to you, those listening to this podcast. Using what you have heard today, you can try this reflective exercise. You'll need a pen and paper to write down these steps or download the takeaway sheet from our website, dgmt.co.za, and go to the podcast section. Write down the following questions and spend some time reflecting on them by yourself, and then share your reflections with your colleagues. Question number 1. Which operational areas do you think your organization can improve on? Question number 2. What has your organization done to improve in these areas? And question number 3. Don't be afraid to think out of the box. Ask yourself, how can you move from survival to sustainability? This is DGMT's Learning Lunch. Until next time.